The blood-stained sky blazed crimson as Hank Owens reined in his Mustang at the ridge, overlooking what remained of the wagon train, his heart sinking at the devastation spread across the prairie below. Montana Territory, 1869, a hard land in hard times, and what lay before him was the hardest sight he'd encountered in his 30 years of life. Smoke still rose from the charred remains of 3 Conestoga wagons. Bodies lay scattered, men who had fought to their last breath to protect their families. Hank had been tracking this wagon train for 2 days, employed as a scout to guide them safely to Virginia City, but he'd fallen behind to hunt when the attack came. The guilt weighed on him heavier than the Colt revolver on his hip. He dismounted carefully, hand hovering near his gun as he approached the wreckage. There was little hope of finding survivors, but he had to look. The Apache who'd done this were long gone, satisfied with the horses and supplies they'd stolen. The first 2 bodies he checked confirmed what he already knew: no survivors. The 3rd wagon had burned nearly to cinders. The 4th had rolled onto its side, its canvas covering torn and flapping in the Montana wind. As he neared it, he heard something, a soft moan that could have been the wind, except it wasn't. Hank drew his pistol and approached cautiously, pushing aside the canvas flap. "Hello," he called. "Anyone alive in there?" Another moan, distinctly human this time. Hank climbed into the overturned wagon, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. At first, all he saw were supplies: flour sacks, tools, household goods, but then he spotted her. A woman, perhaps 25, pinned beneath an overturned trunk. Her dark hair was matted with blood from a gash on her forehead, her dress torn and dirty. But what caught his attention most was the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath the fabric. "Madam," Hank holstered his pistol and knelt beside her. "Can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open blue as the Montana sky and filled with fear when she saw him. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. I was the scout for your wagon train. Name's Hank Owens." "Nora," she whispered. "Nora Evans." Her hand went protectively to her stomach. "My husband," Hank shook his head. "I'm sorry, I haven't found anyone else alive." Tears filled her eyes, but she bit her lip. "The baby," she said. I think it's still all right." Hank nodded. "Let's get you out from under this trunk, then we'll figure out what to do." He lifted the heavy trunk off her legs, relieved to see no obvious broken bones. Still, she was weak from blood loss and the ordeal she'd endured. "How long have you been trapped here?" he asked, offering his canteen. She drank deeply before answering. "Since yesterday morning. They came at dawn. Patrick, my husband, he told me to hide. I crawled in here, and when the wagon tipped." She trailed off, fresh tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. "You're safe now," Hank assured her, though he knew safety was relative in this wilderness. "Columbia's about 3 days' ride from here." "There's a doctor there." Nora's eyes widened. 3 days, but the baby, how far along are you?" 7 months, near as I can reckon. Hank nodded, mind working through their options. "First thing is to get you somewhere safe for the night. There's a creek about a mile east of here. We'll make camp there, then head for Columbia tomorrow." He helped her from the wagon, supporting her weight as her legs trembled beneath her. She insisted on seeing her husband's body, and Hank couldn't deny her that. He led her to where Patrick Evans lay, his rifle still clutched in his hands. Nora knelt beside him, whispering words too private for Hank to hear, and closed her husband's eyes with gentle fingers. "We should bury them," she said when she finished. Hank looked at the dozen bodies scattered across the prairie. "That would take days, madam, and you need medical attention." "Just Patrick," she pleaded. "I can't bear to leave him for the scavengers." Hank couldn't refuse. He found a shovel in the wreckage and dug a grave while Nora gathered wildflowers. They buried Patrick Evans as the sun began to set, Nora reciting what she remembered of the Lord's Prayer in a trembling voice. By the time they reached the creek, darkness had fallen. Hank built a small fire, careful to keep it low to avoid attracting unwanted attention. He'd managed to salvage some supplies from the wagon's blankets, food, a pot for boiling water. Nora sat wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. "You should eat something," Hank said, offering her a plate of beans he'd warmed over the fire. She took it but didn't eat. "Why were you not with the wagon train when it was attacked?" The question hit him like a physical blow. I was hunting. We were low on meat and I saw tracks of a deer. I told Mr. Daniels he was the wagon master that I'd catch up by nightfall. Hank looked away. I should have been there. You'd be dead too, Nora said simply. And I'd still be trapped in that wagon. Her forgiveness, if that's what it was, did little to ease his guilt, but he nodded and encouraged her to eat. When she finally did, he cleaned the gash on her forehead with boiled water and bandaged it with a strip of clean cloth. You should try to sleep, he said. We have a long ride ahead of us tomorrow. I don't think I can sleep, she admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see them, hear them. Hank understood all too well. He'd seen enough violence in his years as a scout and before that as a cavalryman in the war to know how it haunted a person. Tell me about Columbia, she said suddenly. Is it a good place to have a baby? The question caught him off guard. It's a decent town. Growing. There's a Dr. Wilson who knows his business, a few churches, laws kept well enough by Sheriff Taylor. And after, she asked. What would a woman alone with a child do in such a place? The truth was, a widow with a child would face a hard life anywhere in the territory. But Nora Evans had already faced the worst the frontier could offer and survived. There's a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holbrook. She might take you in, give you work. The general store sometimes needs help. Or the schoolhouse might need a teacher if you've got learning. Nora nodded, considering. I taught children back in Ohio before Patrick and I decided to come west. A sad smile crossed her lips. He had dreams of land, of building something for our child. Dreams worth having, Hank said softly. They fell silent for a while, listening to the creek's gentle babble and the occasional hoot of an owl. Finally, Nora's exhaustion won out, and she lay down on the bedroll Hank had prepared for her. He stayed awake, keeping watch, his mind turning over the events of the day and what lay ahead. Dawn broke cool and clear. Hank had dozed only briefly, jerking awake at every sound in the night. Nora still slept, her face peaceful for the first time since he'd found her. He hated to wake her, but knew they needed to move. The Apache might return, and there were other dangers in this country, wolves, bears, and men worse than either. He prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and hardtack softened in the hot liquid. The smell roused Nora from sleep. She winced as she sat up, one hand going to her lower back. Are you all right? Hank asked, concerned. Just stiff, she assured him, and the baby's been restless. He helped her to her feet and offered the coffee. While she drank, he saddled his horse. We'll have to ride double, he explained. It'll slow us down some, but Jasper here is strong. Nora eyed the horse warily. I've never ridden before. In the wagon, always. You'll be fine, Hank promised. I'll be right behind you, holding you steady. Getting her onto the horse proved challenging in her condition, but they managed. Hank mounted behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her secure, the other holding the reins. They set out eastward toward Columbia and whatever future awaited them there. The morning passed slowly. Nora was clearly uncomfortable but didn't complain. At midday, they stopped by a small pond to rest and water the horse. Hank helped Nora down and watched her stretch her legs, concern growing as he noticed her wince again. The baby, he asked. Just moving a lot, she said. Probably doesn't like the riding any more than I do. Hank frowned. Maybe we should rest longer. Nora shook her head. No, I want to get to Columbia as quickly as possible. I'll be fine. They continued their journey, the vast Montana landscape rolling endlessly around them. Hank pointed out landmarks to distract Nora, unusual rock formations, a distant herd of buffalo, an eagle soaring overhead. He told her about the Blackfoot and Crow who called this land home long before white settlers arrived, about the gold strikes that had brought the first rush of pioneers to Montana territory, about the tough but decent folks who decided to stay and build something lasting. As afternoon faded toward evening, Hank spotted a suitable campsite near a stand of cottonwoods. Nora had grown increasingly quiet, and he could feel the tension in her body as he helped her dismount. Truth now, he said, steadying her. How are you feeling? She met his eyes, fear evident in her gaze. The pains started about an hour ago. I thought they might stop, but they're getting stronger. Hank's heart dropped. Pains like the baby's coming, Nora nodded. I think so. It's too early, though, nearly 2 months too early. Hank helped her sit against one of the cottonwoods and tried to think. He knew nothing about birthing babies. The nearest help was still at least 2 days' ride away, and a baby born this early. I'll build a shelter, he decided, make you as comfortable as possible. He worked quickly, using branches and the canvas he'd salvaged from the wagons to create a lean-to that would provide some privacy and protection from the elements. He laid out blankets inside it, built a fire nearby, and put water on to boil. Nora watched him, her face pale but composed. "You've done this before?" she asked. Hank shook his head. "Never, but my mother was a midwife back in Kentucky. I used to hear her talking about it." It wasn't much comfort, he knew, but it was all he had to offer. As darkness fell, Nora's pains increased in frequency and intensity. Hank felt helpless, able only to offer water and words of encouragement that sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He'd faced Apache warriors, blizzards, and wild animals without flinching, but the sight of this brave woman struggling to bring new life into the world terrified him. "Tell me about your home," Nora gasped between contractions. "Where you grew up." Grateful for the distraction, Hank described the small Kentucky farm where he'd been raised, the rolling hills and dense forests, the simple but good life his family had led there before the war came and changed everything. "Why did you come west?" she asked, clutching his hand as another pain gripped her. After the war, home didn't feel like home anymore. Too many ghosts. Hank helped her drink from the canteen. "I followed my brother to Montana. He'd written about the open spaces, how a man could breathe out here. And your brother." Hank's expression darkened. "Died of mountain fever our first winter here, but by then I'd fallen in love with this land, couldn't imagine going back east." Nora's reply was cut off by a cry of pain, longer and more intense than before. Her hands clutched at the blanket beneath her. "I think," she panted, "I think it's coming now." The next hours passed in a blur for Hank. He did what little he could supporting Nora's back when she needed it, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, offering water between contractions. Mostly, he watched in awe as this woman he barely knew fought through pain with a strength he couldn't fathom. Near midnight, with a final push and a cry that seemed to echo across the prairie, Nora brought her child into the world. Hank caught the tiny, slippery form in his trembling hands. "A boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You have a son, Nora," but his heart clenched with fear. The baby was so small, his skin bluish, and he wasn't crying. Remembering his mother's words from long ago, Hank gently rubbed the infant's back, then, when that didn't work, turned him over and gave him the lightest of taps between the shoulder blades. The baby gasped, then let out a thin, reedy cry. Hank nearly wept with relief. Using his knife, he cut the cord as he'd seen his mother do for neighbors, then wrapped the tiny boy in a clean shirt and placed him in Nora's eager arms. "He's beautiful," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "So beautiful." And he was, despite his early arrival and the circumstances of his birth. A shock of dark hair like his mother's, tiny perfect features and surprisingly strong fingers that curled around Nora's thumb when she offered it. "What will you call him?" Hank asked. Nora studied her son's face. "Patrick for his father," she decided. "Patrick Hank Evans." Hank looked up, startled. "You don't have to, I want to," Nora said firmly. "Without you, neither of us would be alive right now." Hank felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the nearby fire. He busied himself cleaning up, giving Nora privacy to nurse her son, though the baby seemed too weak to latch properly. "He needs a doctor," Nora said worriedly when Hank returned. "He's so small." "First light will start for Columbia again," Hank promised. "Try to rest now, both of you." But rest proved elusive. Little Patrick's breathing was labored, and he cried weakly throughout the night. Nora dozed fitfully, waking at every sound. Hank kept the fire burning, his concern growing with each passing hour. He'd seen calves born this early on ranches. Few survived without special care. When dawn finally broke, Hank found Nora awake, tears silently tracking down her cheeks as she gazed at her son. "He's getting weaker," she said softly. "I can feel it." Hank knelt beside them. The baby's skin had a grayish cast now, his breathing more labored than before. "We need to get moving. We'll reach Columbia by tomorrow night if we push hard." "Will he survive the journey?" Nora asked, looking up at him with desperate eyes. Hank couldn't lie to her. "I don't know. But he'll have no chance if we stay here." With gentle care, they fashioned a sling that would allow Nora to carry Patrick against her chest while riding. Hank helped her onto the horse, then mounted behind her, one arm supporting her back. They rode harder that day than Hank would have thought possible for a woman who'd just given birth. Nora didn't complain once, though he knew she must be in considerable pain. All her focus was on the tiny bundle against her chest. By mid-afternoon, Hank spotted a cabin in the distance, the first sign of human habitation they'd seen since the wagon train. Smoke curled from its chimney. "We'll stop there," he decided. "Maybe they can help." As they approached, a man emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand. Hank raised his free arm to show they meant no harm. "Hello, the house," he called. "We need help." The man, gray-bearded and weather-worn, lowered his rifle slightly. "What kind of help? My friend has a newborn," Hank explained as they drew closer. "Born early, he's struggling." The man studied them a moment, then called over his shoulder, "Martha, come out here." A woman appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Nora and the bundle she carried, she hurried forward. "Bring her inside," she ordered, taking charge immediately. "Land's sakes, child, you look half dead yourself." The cabin was small but clean, the main room warmed by a substantial fireplace. Martha, who introduced herself as Martha Cooper, took one look at little Patrick and clucked her tongue. "He's early, all right, and cold as a stone." She turned to her husband. "Robert, heat those bricks and wrap them in flannel, and get that rabbit stew warming." To Nora, she said, "Let me see him properly, dear." Martha examined the baby with experienced hands, listening to his chest and checking his responses. Her face grew grave. "He's struggling hard," she told Nora. "But he's a fighter, I can tell. Can you help him?" Nora asked, voice breaking. "I've helped birth 5 of my own and a dozen from neighboring homesteads," Martha said. "Lost 3 that came this early, saved 2. I'll do what I can." For the next several hours, Martha showed Nora how to keep the baby warm using the heated bricks, how to feed him with a dropper when he couldn't nurse, how to clear his nose and throat when his breathing became labored. Hank stood back, feeling useless but unwilling to leave Nora's side. Robert Cooper pulled him outside eventually. "Your wife needs rest as much as that baby does," he said. "You look like you could use some too." "She's not my wife," Hank corrected automatically. "I found her in a wagon train that was attacked. Her husband was killed." Robert raised his eyebrows but didn't comment further. Instead, he offered Hank tobacco for his pipe and asked about the attack. Hank gave him the details, including the location. "I'll ride out tomorrow with some neighbors," Robert decided. "Give those poor souls a proper burial." Hank nodded gratefully. That would ease Mrs. Evans' mind considerably. "What's your plan?" Robert asked. "After the baby, I mean. Get them to Columbia. There's a doctor there who can help the boy after that." Hank shrugged. "I reckon Mrs. Evans will decide what's best for her and her son." Robert studied him. "You care for her, the widow?" It wasn't a question, and Hank didn't know how to respond. How could he care for a woman he'd only just met? A woman who'd lost her husband mere days ago, a woman whose focus was rightfully on her struggling newborn. And yet, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Nora Evans, her courage, her strength, the gentle way she spoke even in the midst of tragedy. But to acknowledge such feelings now seemed disrespectful to her grief. "I just want to see them safe," he said finally. Robert nodded, seeming to understand what Hank wasn't saying. "Well, they'll stay here tonight. Both need rest before continuing." Inside, they found Nora dozing in a rocking chair, baby Patrick sleeping against her chest. Martha sat nearby, knitting and keeping watch. "His breathing's easier," she reported quietly, "and he took more milk the last time. There's hope for him yet." Hank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, Mrs. Cooper." "Martha," she corrected, "and it's the least any Christian soul would do." She nodded toward a pallet she'd prepared near the fire. "You should sleep, Mr. Owens. You look ready to drop." Hank meant to protest, to insist on keeping watch, but the warmth of the fire and the first sense of safety in days overwhelmed him. Within minutes of stretching out on the pallet, he was fast asleep. He woke to the sound of a baby's cry stronger than before. Morning light streamed through the cabin's small windows. Nora sat at the table, cradling Patrick as Martha prepared breakfast. "There he is," Martha said cheerfully. "Just in time for flapjacks." Hank sat up, running a hand through his hair. "How is he?" he asked, nodding toward the baby. "Better," Nora answered, her face brighter than he'd yet seen it. "He nursed properly this morning and Martha says his color is good." "Doesn't mean he's out of danger," Martha cautioned, "but he's a sight better than when you arrived." Over breakfast, Robert outlined his plan to ride to the Wagon train site with 2 neighbors. Nora thanked him tearfully, giving directions to find her husband's grave. "Will you take something to put on it?" she asked. "A marker of some kind." "Of course," Robert assured her. "We'll see it done right." "And we'll stay here until you return," Martha added. "That little one needs at least another day of rest before traveling again." Hank nodded, relieved. The delay would allow Nora to regain some strength as well. "I appreciate your kindness, both of you." "Nonsense," Martha said briskly. "What kind of people would we be if we turned away a mother and newborn in need? Now eat your breakfast." "Then you can help Robert with the chores while I tend to Mrs. Evans." The day passed peacefully. Hank helped Robert repair a fence, chop wood, and check on the small herd of cattle the Coopers maintained. It felt good to work with his hands, to focus on simple, productive tasks after the intensity of the past few days. From time to time, he glanced toward the cabin, where he could see Nora sitting on the porch with Martha, the baby cradled in her arms. Something about the domestic scene stirred a longing in him he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. By evening, when Robert and his neighbors departed for the Wagon train site, Patrick had nursed several more times and seemed to be gaining strength by the hour. Nora, too, looked better. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and though grief still shadowed her eyes, there was life in them again. After supper, Martha shooed her husband and Hank outside so she could help Nora bathe. The 2 men sat on the porch, smoking their pipes and watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "She's a strong one," Robert commented. "Not many women could endure what she has and still have such gentleness about them." Hank nodded. "I thought the same when I found her." "What will you do when you reach Columbia?" "Find them lodging. Make sure the doctor sees to the baby. Beyond that." Hank shrugged. "It's not my place to decide." Robert knocked his pipe against the porch rail. "Sometimes a man has to make his place, Hank, especially out here." Before Hank could respond, Martha called them back inside. Nora sat by the fire, her damp hair hanging loose down her back, little Patrick sleeping peacefully in a cradle Robert had made for their own children years ago. "Time for bed," Martha announced. "We all need our rest." The next day passed in similar fashion, with Patrick continuing to improve and Nora regaining her strength. By the time Robert and his neighbors returned late that evening, reporting that they'd buried all the dead and marked each grave with a wooden cross, Nora was able to walk around the cabin without assistance, and Patrick was nursing regularly. "We found this in your husband's pocket," Robert said, handing Nora a folded paper. "Thought you might want it." Nora opened it with trembling fingers. It was a deed to land near Virginia City, the destination the Wagon train had been headed for. She traced the writing with her finger, tears welling in her eyes. "Patrick was so certain we'd have a good life there," she said softly. "He saved for 3 years to buy this land sight unseen." No one spoke for a moment. Then Martha said practically, "Well, the land is still there, isn't it?" "And it's yours now." Nora looked up, startled. "Mine, but I couldn't possibly. I mean, a woman alone with a baby." "You wouldn't be the first widow to make a go of it out here," Robert said, "though I won't pretend it would be easy." Hank watched Nora's face as she considered this. He could see her weighing the impossibility of the task against the dream that had brought her west in the first place. "I need to think about it," she said finally, carefully refolding the deed. "Thank you for recovering this, Mr. Cooper. It's the least we could do," Robert assured her. "Now, Martha says you're both strong enough to travel tomorrow. Columbia's a day's ride from here. Hank knows the way." The next morning dawned clear and cool. Martha packed a basket of food for their journey and gave Nora detailed instructions on caring for Patrick. Robert gave Hank a small pistol for Nora. "A woman should be able to protect herself and her child," he said. "Especially out here." Nora accepted it with solemn thanks, tucking it into the pocket of the dress Martha had given her. The goodbyes were emotional, especially between Nora and Martha, who had formed a strong bond in their short time together. "You write to me," Martha insisted. "Let me know how this little one fares." I will, Nora promised, and thank you for everything. With Patrick secure in his sling against Nora's chest, Hank helped her onto Jasper, then mounted behind her. They waved goodbye to the Coopers and set off toward Columbia. The journey was easier than before, with Nora stronger and the baby more stable. They traveled at a steady pace, stopping frequently to allow Nora to nurse Patrick and stretch her legs. By late afternoon, they crested a hill and saw Columbia spread before them in the valley below. It wasn't a large town, perhaps 50 buildings clustered around a main street, with farms and ranches dotting the surrounding countryside. But to Hank and Nora, after days in the wilderness, it looked like a metropolis. There's the doctor's office, Hank pointed out as they rode down the main street. The white building with the green shutters. Dr. Wilson was a young man who'd come west after serving as a surgeon during the war. He examined Patrick thoroughly, his expression growing increasingly pleased. He's small, certainly, he told Nora, but his lungs sound clear and he's nursing well. I'd say he's a remarkable baby, Mrs. Evans. He'll be all right, Nora asked anxiously. Keep him warm, feed him often, and watch for fever or difficulty breathing, Dr. Wilson advised. But yes, I believe he'll thrive. Relief washed over Nora's face. Hank, standing nearby, felt his own tension ease. Now, where are you staying in town? The doctor asked. We've just arrived, Nora explained. I don't know yet. Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house is your best bet, doctor. Wilson suggested. She's a decent woman, fair with her rates. It's 2 blocks down, the blue house with the white fence. They thanked the doctor, paid his fee from the money Hank had saved from his scouting job, and headed for the boarding house. Mrs. Holbrook turned out to be a brisk, efficient widow in her 50s who took one look at Nora and Patrick and ushered them inside. A new mother needs rest and good food, she declared, showing them to a small but clean room at the back of the house. Dinner's at 6, don't be late. Hank hesitated at the door. I'll find a room at the hotel, he said. Nora looked up from where she was laying Patrick in the center of the bed. You're leaving? Just to get a room, he assured her. I'll come back in the morning to check on you both, Mrs. Holbrook, who had been hovering nearby, interjected. I've a spare room upstairs if you're interested. Same rate as the hotel, but better food. Hank accepted gratefully, relieved to be able to stay close to Nora and Patrick. After settling into his room, he went into town to send telegrams informing the families of the wagon train victims about the attack. It was a grim task, but one he felt obligated to perform. By the time he returned, dinner was ready. Nora had bathed and changed into a clean dress Mrs. Holbrook had loaned her. Patrick slept peacefully in a drawer padded with blankets that served as a makeshift cradle. He's already looking stronger, Nora said proudly as Hank admired the sleeping infant. Over dinner, Mrs. Holbrook asked Nora about her plans. Nora hesitated, then told her about the land near Virginia City. It would be madness to try to work it alone, she admitted. But selling it feels like betraying Patrick's dream. You don't have to decide tonight, Mrs. Holbrook said sensibly. Stay here a few weeks, rest, get to know the town. Something will become clear. Later, sitting on the boarding house porch while Nora put Patrick down for the night, Hank considered his own plans. He'd completed his contract with the wagon train tragically, yes, but completed nonetheless. He was free to take another job, move on as he always had. Yet the thought of leaving Nora and Patrick filled him with a sense of loss he couldn't explain, or perhaps he could explain it but wasn't ready to acknowledge it. The door opened behind him, and Nora stepped out. She'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. Patrick's asleep, she said, taking the chair beside Hank. Mrs. Holbrook is watching him. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the town settling down for the night. What will you do now? Nora asked eventually, now that you've delivered us safely. Hank considered his answer carefully. I'm not sure, there's always work for a scout or a ranch hand. Here in Columbia, possibly, he glanced at her. Would that bother you if I stayed in town? Nora looked down at her hands. No, she said softly, it would be comforting. To have a friend nearby. Friend. The word both warmed and stung. What right did he have to hope for more? This woman had lost her husband less than a week ago, had nearly died herself, had brought a child into the world under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. Friendship was all he should offer, all he had any right to expect. Then I'll stay, he said simply. At least until you and Patrick are settled. The next few weeks fell into a pattern. Hank found work at the livery stable, breaking horses and helping with the smithing. Nora and Patrick remained at the boarding house, the baby growing stronger by the day. In the evenings, Hank would visit, sometimes taking Nora for short walks around town while Mrs. Holbrook watched Patrick. Columbia embraced Nora as one of its own. The women of the town, learning her story, rallied around her with gifts of baby clothes, meals, and support. The minister's wife, Mrs. Caldwell, took a particular interest in her welfare, inviting her to church socials and introducing her to potential employers. It was Mrs. Caldwell who arranged for Nora to meet with the town council about the teaching position at the schoolhouse. The previous teacher had left to get married, and the school had been without an instructor for nearly a month. They were impressed with your credentials, Nora told Hank excitedly after the meeting. They've offered me the position starting next month. They were sitting on a bench outside the general store enjoying the mild spring day. Patrick, now 6 weeks old and filling out nicely, slept in a basket at their feet. That's wonderful news, Hank said sincerely. You'll be a fine teacher. The salary is modest, Nora admitted, but there's living quarters above the schoolhouse, 2 rooms and a kitchen. It would be enough for Patrick and me. Hank nodded, ignoring the twinge of disappointment he felt. Nora moving to the schoolhouse meant an end to their evening visits at the boarding house. But it was a good opportunity for her, a chance to build a life for herself and her son. What about the land in Virginia City? He asked. Have you decided what to do about that? Nora sighed. I still don't know. Part of me wants to keep it for Patrick when he's grown, but it seems a waste to let it sit empty when another family could be building a life there. You could lease it, Hank suggested. Find someone to work it and share the profits. That way you keep ownership but still put the land to use. Nora's eyes brightened. I hadn't thought of that. It's a good solution. She smiled at him, that warm, genuine smile that never failed to quicken his pulse. You always seem to know what to do, Hank. He shook his head, embarrassed by the praise. Just practical thinking is all. A comfortable silence fell between them. Hank watched Patrick sleep, marveling at how much the boy had grown since his precarious birth on the prairie. His features were becoming more defined, Nora's blue eyes, but a chin that must have come from his father. I received a letter today, Nora said suddenly, from my sister in Ohio. I wrote to her after we arrived here, telling her what happened. What did she say? She wants me to come home. Says Patrick and I could live with her and her husband, that it would be safer, easier than trying to make a life out here. Nora looked out at the bustling main street of Columbia. Perhaps she's right. Hank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. The thought of Nora leaving Montana, taking Patrick back east, left him feeling hollow. But what right did he have to influence her decision? Her sister's offer made sense: family, security, a familiar place. Is that what you want? He asked carefully. To go back to Ohio? Nora was quiet for a long moment. I came west because Patrick, my husband, believed in the promise of this land. He believed we could build something here, something that would last. She looked down at her sleeping son. When I was trapped in that wagon, certain I would die, I made a promise. I promised that if we survived the baby and I would be brave enough to live the life Patrick had dreamed for us. She turned to face Hank, her expression resolute. So no, I don't want to go back to Ohio. This is where Patrick's father is buried. This is where his son should grow up. Relief washed over Hank, so intense it almost made him dizzy. Then you'll take the teaching position? Nora nodded. Yes, and perhaps someday when Patrick is older we'll see about that land near Virginia City. As spring deepened into summer, Nora settled into her new role as Columbia's schoolteacher. The rooms above the schoolhouse became a cozy home for her and Patrick. Hank continued his work at the livery stable, and in his free time he helped Nora with repairs to the schoolhouse and her living quarters. Their friendship deepened, though neither spoke of the growing feelings between them. It seemed too soon, too complicated. Nora was still grieving, still finding her footing as a widow and a mother. Hank was content to be in her life in whatever capacity she needed him, though each day he found himself more drawn to her quiet strength, her gentle humor, her unwavering devotion to her son. The town noticed, of course. Small communities always do. There were whispers, some disapproving of how often Hank visited the young widow, others more understanding. Mrs. Holbrook became one of their staunchest defenders, telling anyone who would listen that Mr. Owens was simply being a good Christian, helping a woman who had no one else to rely on. One warm evening in late July, Hank arrived at the schoolhouse with a special gift, a rocking horse he'd carved for Patrick. The boy was too young for it yet, just over 3 months old, but Hank had worked on it in his spare time, wanting to create something that would last. Nora was delighted. "Hank, it's beautiful," she said, running her hand over the smooth wooden mane. "Patrick will love it when he's older." "It's nothing fancy," Hank said modestly, "just thought he should have something special." They sat on the small porch behind the schoolhouse, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Patrick lay on a blanket nearby, cooing and kicking his legs. "He's trying to roll over," Nora said proudly. "Dr. Wilson says he's developing right on schedule despite his early arrival." Hank smiled, watching the baby's determined efforts. "He's strong, like his mother." Nora blushed at the compliment. "I've been thinking about the land near Virginia City," she said, changing the subject. "Your idea about leasing it was good. I've written to the land office there, asking if they know of anyone looking for such an arrangement." "That's sensible," Hank agreed. "No need to rush a decision." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by Patrick's occasional gurgles. Hank found himself studying Nora's profile in the fading light, the gentle curve of her cheek, the way tendrils of her dark hair escaped from her simple bun, the quiet contentment in her expression as she watched her son. "I'm leaving for a few days," he said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. "Thought I'd ride out to Virginia City, take a look at that land of yours, see what condition it's in." Nora turned to him, surprised. "You do that?" "It's at least a 3-day journey each way," Hank nodded. "I'd feel better knowing exactly what you have there, whether it's good for farming or ranching, how the water access is, that sort of thing. Make it easier for you to decide what to do with it." "That's very kind of you, Hank." Nora's voice was soft. "But I can't ask you to make such a journey on my account." "You didn't ask, I offered," he smiled at her. "Besides, it's been a while since I've ridden more than a few miles from Columbia. Might do me good to see some different country." The truth was, Hank needed some distance to think. His feelings for Nora had grown stronger with each passing day, and he feared they were beginning to show too clearly. The last thing he wanted was to burden her with his affection before she was ready, if she would ever be ready. Nora studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but promise you'll be careful." "Always am," he assured her. "I'll leave tomorrow, be back in about 10 days. The journey to Virginia City was uneventful, the trail well marked and relatively safe. The land itself, when Hank found it using the deed's description, exceeded his expectations. It was good bottom land near a creek, with rich soil and enough timber for building. Patrick Evans had chosen well for his family's future. Hank spent 2 days exploring the property, making mental notes of its features and potential. He even staked out where a cabin might be built, imagining a home there someday, though he tried not to picture himself in that future. In Virginia City, he spoke with the land office about potential lessees and learned of a young couple looking for exactly such an arrangement. He took their information for Nora to consider. The return journey seemed longer, his thoughts constantly turning to Columbia and what awaited him there. He'd been gone 8 days when he crested the familiar hill overlooking the town. It was late afternoon, the buildings golden in the slanting light. Hank headed straight for the schoolhouse, eager to share what he'd learned about the land. He found Nora in the garden behind the building, hanging laundry while Patrick napped in a basket in the shade. Her face lit up when she saw him, a reaction that sent his heart racing. "Hank, you're back early," he dismounted, suddenly uncertain what to do with his hands. The travel was good. "No delays." Nora abandoned her laundry and came to greet him. For a moment he thought she might embrace him, but she stopped short, clasping her hands in front of her instead. "How was the journey? Did you find the land?" Hank nodded, removing his hat. "I did. It's good land, Nora." "Your husband chose well." He described the property in detail, watching her eyes grow bright with interest and a touch of wistfulness. When he mentioned the young couple looking to lease such land, she nodded thoughtfully. It sounds promising, I'll write to them. They moved to the porch, where Hank could see Patrick sleeping peacefully. The boy had grown even in the short time he'd been away, his cheeks fuller, his dark hair longer. He's missed you, Nora said softly, following his gaze. He looks for you when he hears a man's voice. Hank's throat tightened. He's too young to remember me being gone. Perhaps, Nora smiled. But I've told him stories about the brave scout who saved us both. I want him to know when he's older what you did for us. Anyone would have done the same, Hank said, uncomfortable with her gratitude. No, Nora said firmly. Not anyone. She hesitated, then added, I missed you too, Hank. The simple admission hung in the air between them. Hank looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she might welcome what he truly wanted to say. What he saw there gave him courage. Nora, I need to tell you something, and if it's not what you want to hear, we can forget I ever said it. He took a deep breath. These past months, getting to know you and Patrick, being part of your lives, it's meant more to me than I can say. I know it's too soon, that you're still grieving Patrick, your husband, and you have every right to tell me I'm overstepping. Hank, Nora began, but he held up a hand. Please let me finish. I care for you, Nora, more than I thought possible, and for Patrick too. I know I can never replace his father, but I would consider it the greatest honor if someday, when you're ready, you might think of me as more than just the man who found you in that wagon. Nora was quiet for so long that Hank began to regret his words. Then she reached out and took his hand, her touch sending warmth through him. When I lost Patrick, my husband, I thought my heart had died with him, she said softly. I couldn't imagine ever feeling anything again except grief and fear, but these past months. She squeezed his hand. You've shown me that it's possible to honor his memory while still moving forward, that there can be life after such loss. Hope rose in Hank's chest. Does that mean? It means I care for you too, Hank Owens, Nora said, her blue eyes meeting his. More than I thought possible, given everything, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for what you're suggesting. Not yet. Hank nodded, understanding. I'm not asking for any promises, Nora. Just the chance to keep being part of your life, to see where this might lead in time. I'd like that, she said simply. Very much. In that moment, Patrick woke and began to fuss. Nora went to him, lifting him from his basket and bringing him back to where Hank stood. The baby's eyes widened when he saw Hank, and his tiny face broke into a toothless smile. He does remember you, Nora said, delight in her voice. Hank reached out, letting Patrick grab his finger with surprising strength. Hello, little man, he said softly. I've missed you too. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Hank and Nora's relationship deepened. They were careful, mindful of the town's potential gossip, but it became common knowledge that Mr. Owens and the widow Evans were, as Mrs. Holbrook put it, walking out together. Nora arranged to lease the Virginia City land to the young couple Hank had found, with terms that would provide her a modest but steady income. With that and her teaching salary, she was able to establish a secure, if simple, life for herself and Patrick. Hank continued his work at the livery stable, earning the owner's trust and eventually becoming a partner in the business. He moved from the hotel to a small cabin on the edge of town, spending his free time making improvements to the property. Patrick thrived, growing into a happy, healthy baby with his mother's blue eyes and a curious nature that delighted everyone who knew him. By his 6-month birthday, he was sitting up on his own and reaching eagerly for Hank whenever he visited. One crisp October evening, Hank invited Nora to dinner at his cabin. Mrs. Holbrook agreed to watch Patrick, giving Nora her first evening to herself since his birth. Hank had spent days preparing, cleaning the cabin until it shone and practicing a special meal he'd learned from his mother, fried chicken with all the fixings. He'd even picked wildflowers for the table, an act that earned him good-natured teasing from the men at the livery. Nora arrived just as the sun was setting, wearing a blue dress that brought out her eyes. Her hair was down, falling in soft waves past her shoulders, and she looked younger somehow without the weight of motherhood visibly upon her. This is lovely, she said, looking around the cabin. You've made it so warm and inviting. It's nothing fancy, Hank said, suddenly nervous, but it's home. The evening passed in comfortable conversation. They talked of Patrick's latest accomplishments, of the school's upcoming harvest festival, of the changes coming to Columbia as the town continued to grow. Throughout dinner, Hank found himself watching Nora the way she laughed, the graceful movement of her hands as she spoke, the warmth in her eyes when they met his. After the meal, they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. The stars were emerging one by one in the darkening sky, the mountains' black silhouettes against the last glow of sunset. "I've been thinking," Hank said, breaking a comfortable silence. "About the future." Nora turned to him, her expression open. "What about it?" "I've saved enough to buy out my partner at the livery. He's wanting to move back east, and I've always thought I might like to own a business someday." Hank hesitated, then pressed on. "But before I make such a commitment to Columbia, I wanted to be sure. That is, I hoped." "Yes, Hank." Nora's voice was gentle, encouraging. He took a deep breath. "Nora Evans, I love you. I think I've loved you since I found you in that wagon, though I didn't recognize it then, and I love Patrick as if he were my own son." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I'm asking if you might consider making a family with me, you, me, and Patrick. If it's too soon, I understand, but I wanted you to know where my heart stands." Nora's eyes glistened with tears in the fading light. For a terrifying moment, Hank thought he'd misjudged everything. Then she placed her hand over his. "It's not too soon," she said softly. "Not for how I feel." "And how is that?" Hank asked, hardly daring to hope. "I love you, Hank Owens. You brought me back to life when I thought all was lost. You gave me and Patrick a future when we had none." She smiled through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you. We'll be a family, you, me, and Patrick." Hank's heart soared. He opened the box, revealing a simple gold band with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "My father gave it to her when they settled in Kentucky," said the pearl reminded him of how precious she was, how rare their love. He slipped the ring onto Nora's finger, marveling at how right it looked there. Then, with a gentleness that belied his rugged exterior, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her for the first time, a kiss that spoke of promises kept and new beginnings. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Columbia, with Patrick, now 7 months old, gurgling happily in Mrs. Holbrook's arms. The entire town turned out for the celebration, their initial misgivings about the match long forgotten in the face of such obvious devotion. Nora wore a simple ivory dress that Mrs. Caldwell had helped her make, her dark hair adorned with wildflowers. Hank, unrecognizable to many in his new suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle toward him. The minister spoke of new beginnings, of love born in adversity, of family forged through choice rather than blood. When it came time for their vows, Hank's voice was steady, his promise to love and protect Nora and Patrick unwavering. Nora's response was equally firm, her eyes never leaving his as she pledged her heart. After the ceremony, the town gathered for a celebration at the schoolhouse. There was dancing and feasting, laughter and tears. Little Patrick, passed from one admiring woman to another, seemed to understand the importance of the day, smiling widely at everyone who held him. As the evening drew to a close, Hank and Nora slipped away to his cabin, now their cabin, leaving Patrick with Mrs. Holbrook for the night. Walking hand in hand under the starlit sky, they spoke of their future, the changes they'd make to the cabin to accommodate their growing family, the possibility of someday building on the land near Virginia City, the life they would create together. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Nora admitted as they reached the cabin. "After losing Patrick, after everything that happened, it seemed impossible." Hank lifted her hand to his lips, kissing the ring that now bound them together. "Nothing's impossible, Mrs. Owens. Not when two people decide to face life together." The years that followed proved the truth of his words. Hank became the sole owner of the livery stable, expanding it to include a blacksmith shop that served not just Columbia, but the surrounding ranches as well. Nora continued teaching until the birth of their first child, together a son they named Robert, after the man who had helped save Patrick's life. Patrick grew into a strong, intelligent boy who idolized his stepfather and doted on his younger brother. He knew the story of his birth, of how Hank had found him and his mother in the wreckage of the wagon train, of his biological father's dream for their future. Rather than confusing him, this knowledge seemed to give him a sense of being specially chosen, twice blessed with fathers who loved him. When Patrick turned 5, Hank and Nora took him to visit his father's grave. The wooden cross Robert Cooper had placed was still standing, though weathered by Montana's harsh seasons. They replaced it with a proper headstone, and Nora told Patrick stories of the man whose courage and dreams had brought them west. On the journey back to Columbia, they visited the land near Virginia City, Patrick's inheritance. The young couple leasing it had made improvements, building a small cabin and planting orchards. Seeing it, Nora squeezed Hank's hand. "Someday," she said. "Not yet, but someday I'd like to build our home here. Patrick's father would have wanted that." Hank nodded, understanding. "Whenever you're ready. Columbia's been good to us, but this land, it has a future too." 3 years later, after the birth of their daughter Emily, they made that move. The livery stable in Columbia was sold to a capable young man Hank had trained himself. The schoolhouse position was handed over to a new teacher with Nora's careful guidance. They built a home on the land Patrick Evans had purchased, a substantial house with room for their growing family, and the dreams they continued to nurture together. Hank established a horse breeding operation that soon gained reputation throughout the territory. Nora, when not busy with the children, wrote articles for the Virginia City newspaper about education and frontier life. Patrick, growing tall and strong like both his fathers, learned to ride and rope and care for the land that would someday be his. Little Robert followed his every move, while Emily, blue-eyed like her mother and brother, charmed everyone who met her with her quick wit and kind heart. And in the quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the day's work was done, Hank and Nora would sit on their porch, watching the stars emerge over the Montana landscape. They both loved, marveling at the journey that had brought them together, a journey that began in tragedy but led to a life richer and more fulfilling than either could have imagined. "Do you ever think about it?" Nora asked one such evening, their 10th anniversary approaching. "That day you found me in the wagon," Hank's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Every day," he admitted. "I think about how close I came to losing you before I ever really knew you." How different our lives might have been. Nora nestled closer against him. "I used to think it was cruel fate that took Patrick from me, that left me alone to face childbirth and the future. Now I see it differently." "How so?" "Not cruel fate, but a kind of redemption. One door closed, yes, but another opened." She looked up at him, her face softened by the years but still beautiful to him, still the face he loved waking up to each morning. "I miss him sometimes, and I'm grateful for the love we had. But what we've built together, Hank, you and me and our children, it's more than I ever dared hope for, even in the best of times." Hank kissed her then, a kiss filled with the depth of feeling that had only grown stronger over the years. "I found treasure in the wreckage that day," he said softly. "And I've been the richest man in Montana ever since." As night fell fully over the land that had witnessed both their greatest sorrows and their deepest joys, they remained on the porch together, the future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Montana sky above.